Good morning. Welcome to this Middle East Institute webinar on energy markets in the Middle East. It's a pleasure to have this presentation and discussion this morning with two experts I know and respect so much. We'll hear first from Michael Cohen as he shares some data from the BP 2021 Statistical Review on energy production and consumption globally in the pandemic, with some focus on the Middle East. And then we'll have some remarks from Carole Nakhle on the MENA impacts we might expect in this volatile energy transition moment. Big questions are on growing energy demand across MENA and emerging markets, how governments will meet electricity needs, and from what sources, conventional or renewable, and what an expected plateau in oil demand means for MENA producers. Questions on when exactly that plateau occurs, as the Secretary General of OPEC said in an interesting webinar just this morning with the Atlantic Council, that he expected growth in oil demand in the 25 million barrel per day range across emerging markets, particularly as population growth accelerates in Africa. So I'm Karen Young. I'm director of the new program on economics and energy at MEI. And please welcome these two speakers. If you don't know them, Michael Cohen leads BP's oil and refining analysis in the Strategy and Sustainability Group, and he's chief US economist for BP. He's part of the team within Strategy and Sustainability called Economic and Energy Insights, which produces the Energy Outlook, and BP's annual Statistical Review of World Energy. Carole Nakhle is the founder and CEO of Crystol Energy, an advisory and research firm based in London. She's an energy economist, and I'm pleased to say that Carole is also a member of our advisory council here at MEI's program on economics and energy. So really a pleasure to have you both with us today. Michael, the floor is yours, and then we'll have Carole share some remarks. In our audience, if you'd like to ask a question, you can use the Q&A function and type your question. If you're viewing from YouTube, you can email questions to MEI at events@mei.edu. And Michael, please feel free to share your slides and start your presentation. Thank you.
Thank you, Karen. And it's really a pleasure to be here. It's a pleasure to be part of the Middle East Institute's program here, and I'm excited to share some of the key takeaways from what happened in 2020 in terms of world energy. I just want to confirm that you all can see the front slide. Great. So we at BP have been doing the statistical review for the last 70 years. Since roughly early 1950s, it's tracked the ups and downs of the energy system, whether it's the Suez crisis, the Iran-Iraq war, the Fukushima disaster, anything and everything under the sun. We have been tracking as part of this statistical review. And the goal here and every year is to ensure that we are keeping up with the times and including new data as well. But last year, there was probably no better year to look at how the energy system responded to a crisis than what happened in 2020. And so we asked ourselves three key questions. What happened last year? How surprising was it? What did we learn about how the system responded to a stress test, such as that was imposed by COVID? And then the other thing that we did last year was sort of look back 5 years and think about what has the world achieved in the last 5 years since the Paris Agreement was concluded, especially in this lead up to COP26. So in addition, I wanted to highlight a couple of the key takeaways and key issues that the analysis highlighted and the implications for the Middle East this morning as well, this afternoon, wherever you find yourself. So as you look back on what happened in 2020 and what we're still living through right now is a global economic system that was thrown into its biggest contraction since World War II. And so what this chart is showing here is the very large contraction that we saw in GDP growth. And if you look at how that contraction in GDP growth played out in the energy system and therefore from global CO2 emissions, it was basically very similar in terms of a trend on an annual basis. So energy demand last year fell by a little over 4%. Emissions from energy use also fell sharply, by the largest since World War II. And both of these declines in both energy demand and emissions were the largest since the late 1940s. And so the interesting thing here is that the fall of 2 gigatons in CO2 emissions last year were basically bringing the world energy system back to levels that we haven't seen since 2011. Now, when we break this down into the components of energy demand, you can see that energy demand overall fell by about 5%, but the biggest fall overall came from oil. And that was, as you know, no surprise to any of us, as we saw a big contraction and a change in all of our behaviors to try to stem the spread of the virus. Now, when you look at what happened in the Middle East, the most interesting thing is that in addition to the decline in energy and the decline in oil that was very similar to what we saw on a global basis, you can see that natural gas consumption actually increased by 1.2% last year. There was actually an increase in renewables consumption as well by about 30% last year, but is again on a very, very small base. The interesting thing as well that I want to highlight on a global scale, so you look at this chart, which is showing, again, orange for the world, blue for the Middle East, and here in red is China, is that despite the slowdown in Chinese economic growth from about 4.5% or 5% to just 2%, we still saw a very carbon intensive growth in energy demand in China despite all of what happened. And so the meta point here that I want to highlight is that when you combine all of these changes on a global basis and you look at what the change was in terms of overall energy related CO2 emissions, we saw last year a 6% fall. And so that fall looks really great, but it's this kind of decline that we need to see every year for the next 30 years to get to something like an 85% or 70% decline in some of the deep decarbonization scenarios that we see from whether it's the IEA's Sustainable Development Scenario, in BP's Rapid Scenario, and some of the scenarios that you see published by those like IHS or Wood Mackenzie. And the point here that I want to highlight as well is that when you decompose the contribution in terms of energy demand growth or decline and the intensity of that energy demand, you can see that last year there was a very large decline in the intensity of growth, and much of that was because of the very sharp decline in oil. And so what that means going forward is that as we come back from this virus and as oil demand starts to rebound, and what we're seeing right now in the market is that it is, that decline of 6% in carbon emissions is likely to be just temporary. Because both that decline in primary energy and the decline in carbon intensity can both be related to that fall in oil demand. And so the problem is that if you think about the overall contraction in GDP growth last year, and you think about what that implies in terms of the carbon price, you basically, if you divide the carbon emissions and you equate that to the decline in nominal GDP, it implies a carbon price of something like $1,400 per ton. So a really, really, really high number. And so the moral of the story here is that locking down the transport system is something that we, of course, want to avoid. But the problem is we would need to be able to see these kinds of declines of 6% every year, and we need to see that on a more sustainable basis so that we don't see such a sharp disruption. So I want to turn now to oil specifically. And if you look at the fall in oil demand, it accounted for roughly 3/4 of the overall decline in energy consumption last year. And if you look at what happened in the Middle East and in the United States and in other key consumers and producers, it was a broad board across the board a decline in oil demand. When you break it down into its different components, it was clearly the largest component of the decline came from jet fuel and kerosene on a percentage basis. Those declined by about 40%, and gasoline demand fell by about 13% as mobility measures and other behaviors caused a decline in gasoline. But the key point of this chart is not necessarily just to look at the declines, but also to look at the resilience of the petrochemical sector. So naphtha, ethane, and LPG all were broadly flat, supported in part by demand for PPE and other medical and hygiene-related supplies. Now, overall, what happened in 2020 and what we're still living through now was basically a result of severe mismatches in supply and demand. And I'm not going to spend too much time for this because this is kind of old news, but the point here is that after a certain amount of time, after a month and a half, we finally saw OPEC Plus be able to garner the troops, so to say, and deliver a reduction in supply in line with the contraction in demand. Now, the opposite is happening now, but I think the point here is that OPEC was very well positioned, of course, after a couple weeks, but was well positioned because of its cartel-like behavior and because of the nature of the organization to deliver on a decline in supply and to adjust. And so the point that we want to make here is that OPEC was very able to do that in the face of something that was perceived to be something that was temporary. And so at a certain point, I think it's right to question whether they will continue to be preserving market share or maximizing revenue going forward. Clearly, what happened last year was an example of where they were maximizing revenue and withholding supply. But in the face of something that is more permanent and more structural, I think we have to wonder whether they would continue to have the same behaviors. And so that's something that we need to think about, and it goes the same way for natural gas prices as well and for the natural gas market. So the other thing that I think you can do with the statistical review data and with other sources of data of this type is to decompose what is happening to oil demand in certain countries and what's happening in other countries. And so what I did for some other analysis just recently is I tried to decompose the different countries of the world into countries where oil demand was growing through 2019 and those where it was not. And so to give you a sense of what this looks like, there's a growing share that accounts for a third of today's oil demand, and there's a shrinking share that accounts for the other 2/3. And so the point here to note is that the chart here is showing that the growth rate of that third of oil demand is growing less fast over the last 5 years, from about 1.5 million barrels a day of growth each year to now less than, by the time we got to 2019, less than 1 million barrels a day of growth. And so why is this happening? I would contend, and I think it's important to understand that the intensity of economic growth, the oil intensity specifically of economic growth, is starting to change. And we've seen a convergence in oil intensity across different regions. This is something that has been pointed out by Christoph Ruhl over the course of the last several months, and some work that he's done in addition when he was with our group at BP, but also has been published by Center on Global Energy Policy at Columbia and at Harvard. And so this chart is using the same statistical review data and just shows how that oil intensity of GDP is declining. And it's declining actually faster in non-OECD countries even than it is in OECD countries. And so, of course, COVID disrupted some of this trend. We saw as oil demand started to rebound, this turned the opposite way. But this is a very hard trend line overall to argue with, and it has broadly been the same since the late 1980s. And so I think this does raise a question in terms of the wide range of scenarios in terms of oil demand that we can see going forward. And in the face of this very wide range of oil demand, I think it's important for some of the countries in the region to think about what the future is and what are the probabilities that oil demand may begin to plateau or even peak as we get into the 2030 and beyond timeframe. So this is the kind of analysis that you can do with this statistical review. So I want to pivot a little bit to what happened in the gas market. And so in 2020, we saw LNG imports continuing to increase into Europe, and it did as well as the dynamic in OPEC countries. It raises the question of the extent to which Russia and other key pipeline gas exporters are going to continue to compete against LNG to maintain their market share, or instead forego some of that share to avoid driving prices too low. So last year we saw U.S. LNG exports decline and the utilization rate decline. We saw this disconnect in terms of price between the short-run marginal cost of delivering LNG in the U.S. market into Europe, and because there was that disconnect between the NBP price in the UK and the marginal cost of operating or the operating cost of an LNG facility, we started to see that utilization rate start to decline. And this was really the first time that this happened. Over the course of the rest of the year, Russian exporters decided to forego some of that market share. And so in part, that led to this rebound in terms of the utilization rate at U.S. export facilities. But again, this was a temporary dynamic, and we can't say with any level of clarity about whether that kind of behavior is likely to be imitated or emulated going forward in the face of a structural decline in European natural gas imports as a result of an energy transition that sees less natural gas demanded. The other point I want to make on the gas market is that when you look at what happened in the Middle East, so we've seen, as this chart here shows in the top left, oil and natural gas-fired generation are basically a mirror image of themselves. And of course, for those of you that know the dynamic, there's been a broad push by many countries in the Middle East to maximize their oil exports by substituting for natural gas in the power sector. And so you can see that the gas-fired generation share has increased pretty substantially from the mid-2010s up through 2020, up to almost 70% of generation is now gas-fired in the Middle East. And you can see that depending on the country, you can see some fluctuations, but overall the trend is clear. Now, when you take the total production and the total consumption and look at it on a net export basis, you can see that while we've seen continued increase in natural gas production in the Middle East, it's been also seen at the same time a broader increase in natural gas consumption. And so while we saw from 2005 until about 2015 a pretty substantial increase in net exports from the Middle East of natural gas, it has basically plateaued because of this continued increase in natural gas consumption. Now, overall, this is much better than seeing oil consumed in the power sector, but I do think it is worth thinking about how this compares to what happened, as you're substituting natural gas for oil, so too could you be substituting renewables for natural gas and maximizing the potential for natural gas exports from the region. So when you think about this, the other chart here I wanted to show is the growth in wind and solar capacity on a global basis. So these are deltas, these are change year on year, right? This isn't an overall level. When you think about the overall level, there's less than 1% global of PV capacity or photovoltaic solar capacity that is now in the Middle East. So although I said earlier a strong growth of 30%, it still represents just a tiny hairline fracture of total PV installed capacity on a global basis. And even if I added in Algeria and Egypt and Morocco into this, it still ends up at 1.2%. So it's a very, very small amount. the other point that this chart makes is just how quickly renewables can grow despite supply chain issues and with the proper policy backdrop. And so you can see just how big the growth was from China in both wind and solar last year. So the other thing I want to highlight, and this is just looking back at what happened from the Paris Agreement, is that we've made quite a significant improvement in reducing energy poverty. But and so if you look at the total population, it's gone from roughly 15% that is below what the UN defines as an energy minimum, and that's gone down to something like 10% of the world population right now. But COVID basically reversed that, and we saw for the first time in 2020 the number of people without access to electricity actually increasing. But the problem is that the UN defines access to electricity in terms of a minimum level of residential consumption. But the level of energy that's actually needed to support strong and sustainable economic growth is likely to far exceed that. And so the Energy for Growth Hub has come up with an alternative definition that is basically 4 times higher than the UN definition. And based on that definition, there's roughly 3.5 billion people that are living below a world energy minimum. And that equates to something like half of the world population. Now, why do I mention all this? In other words, other than just to make that point, that the modern energy minimum is slightly higher than the UN definition, I make this point because there's quite a bit of wasted energy out there. And so in combination with some work that we did with the Payne Institute at the Colorado School of Mines has been doing this and using satellites along with the World Bank to publish a data series on gas flaring. We decided we wanted to publish this at a country level and in a historical time series, and add it to our CO2 emissions estimate last year. And so what it shows you is that overall flaring of about 150 BCM in total on a global level, and it has continued to grow at a rate of about 2% per year over the last decade. And so what this chart is showing here is the individual countries that are contributing to that, at least the top oil and gas producers. And the sad thing is that despite looking at what has been done over the last several years, the Global Gas Flaring Reduction Initiative, all of the attention and media attention around flaring, and companies, including ourselves, taking a very proactive role in reducing the flaring intensity at a macro level. Over the last 5 years, flaring intensity, which I'm measuring here as overall flaring divided by the oil and gas that is produced, that flaring intensity is not really improving. Depending on how it's measured, it's either the same or slightly worse than it was during the prior 5-year period. So I think it's important to continue to be aware of these trends and ensure that companies across the board, no matter where they sit and no matter whether they're public facing or NOCs, that we drive that continued attention towards reducing this energy waste, because that 150 BCM of flared gas, although not all of it could be conceivably marketed tomorrow or even next year, can do a lot to help reduce that energy poverty that still exists in this world. So some key takeaways, and then I'll stop. So it's clear, and I think I tried to make the point at least, that both for OPEC Plus and for Russia in the oil and natural gas market respectively, they were responding to temporary shocks, and the energy transition is likely to be anything but temporary. It's going to be something that is permanent, maybe underestimated, and may come possibly sooner than we think in some scenarios. And that means that countries' strategies, it means company strategies as well, all need to be robust to any of those possible outcomes of oil demand that I showed. And so when you look at the renewable system as well, we saw this very, very strong growth across the board. but it was in part, we were given a pass last year because energy demand started to fall so quickly and fell last year so quickly. So in a world where energy demand is growing by leaps and bounds, as we're likely to see over the course of the latter part of this year and 2022 and 2023, that growth in renewables may not be sufficient to kick coal out of the power sector. The third point I wanted to make is just that the 6% decline is the kind of decline we need to see every year, but it needs to be far more sustainable. And that is likely to mean that a year will have gone by and the hurdle or the mountain to climb in terms of reducing emissions is we're going to lose an entire year. And that means that it will be even steeper to meet that 2050 target or 2030 target for countries across the world. So all of the solutions need to be on the table. Everyone, all different players need to be part of that conversation. And that's something that we need to be concerned about going forward. Finally, the gas intensity in the Middle East is increasing pretty dramatically. And so as a result, the potential for increased gas exports is going to begin to be and has already been threatened by that increase in natural gas intensity. And so why not focus on continuing to reduce flaring to start to help that in addition to other solutions in the region. And so the final point I would just make, in addition to showing again that there is a substantial amount of the world population that falls below a modern energy minimum, it is the case that economic growth is becoming far less oil intensive. And that is a trend that is likely to stay with us for quite some time. So with that, I'll stop, and I look forward to discussion and to Carole's remarks.
Thank you so much, Michael. That's some really in-depth coverage, and I love seeing the way that you've been able to use the data from the statistical review to make some really interesting conclusions, particularly for the Middle East. So a lot on kind of gas markets, a lot of potential, but as you say, we're seeing also not a whole lot of investment going into the sector right now, and so there's a bit of a mismatch. But Carole, I know you have a lot to say and sort of drive some of these findings to implications for the Middle East, North Africa. So I hand it over to you.
Thank you, Karen, and hello, everyone. It's great to join you from the Black Forest in Germany. Well, I enjoyed Michael's presentation a lot, and there's a lot I can cover, but I'm not going to give a presentation. I just picked up 4 important aspects and in relation to the Middle East, and hopefully we can discuss them and other things in more depth later on. But the first thing, to build on what you were saying, Karen, the issue of gas in the Middle East, and it's true, you can see that how actually I find it fascinating that gas consumption in the Middle East increased, and while net exports have stalled, it indicates that production domestically is increasing. And that is interesting because for a long time, the Middle East has been lagging when it comes to natural gas. They sit as a region, they sit on the world's largest proven gas reserves, and yet they are the 3rd largest producers as a region. And actually, if you take Qatar and to a much lesser extent Oman, I can easily say that the whole region becomes easily a net importing region. And there are grand plans. So if I think of Saudi Arabia, for instance, I'm looking at their gas plans. They have 3 major targets: doubling gas production from the levels they have today, eliminating the use of oil in power and replacing it largely by natural gas, and becoming a gas exporter all by 2030. So in less than 9 years from now. So these are very ambitious targets. And there are many drivers behind that. Michael mentioned the economic rationale, which makes perfect sense to safeguard oil exports because oil is much more valuable in terms of generating revenues to the States. And in countries like Iraq, for example, it's fascinating to see Iraq, the largest flaring nation in the world, gas flaring nation. So there is an environmental dimension to that. But there is also another dimension whereby natural gas is a feedstock for petchem, for the petrochemical industry. And that is something the region is investing heavily into. So if you look at ADNOC, at Aramco, for example, you can see they are putting massive amounts in petchem because, as Michael said, it has been very resilient in the COVID crisis, and it's likely to be resilient for the years to come. The second point I want to highlight and add to what Michael said, I love this kind of highlighting the issue of the COVID shock, versus the energy transition, one being a temporary shock, even though we feel that's not ending anytime soon, but still temporary by its nature, versus when oil demand really peaks, and that is a structural trend that is unlikely to be reversed if we believe all the forecasting scenarios and models that we have out there. So what we saw last year, this kind of collaboration, not only between OPEC Plus, I would say, if you remember, in March 2020, we saw countries that we never thought of, like, because they were the promoters and the leaders of the free world and free competition, including led by the US, supporting OPEC Plus. And this is where people were saying, okay, so COVID-19 gave us a snapshot of how the world will look like when oil demand peaks, and that will increase collaboration between producers. That is not necessarily the case, because we're going to talk about we're going to face a more structural, permanent shock, and most likely this is when competition is likely to intensify between producers. Of course, we cannot rule out any political drivers, but in such a world, it's usually the low-cost producer that is the last to leave the market. And this takes me to the economic dimension, the macroeconomic dimension, because Michael referred to the importance of these producers to be more robust in the face of a peaking oil demand. Now, of course, the Middle East is blessed with the low-cost oil and gas resources in the world. But that is by itself not sufficient. We have to think about the overall economic needs, the needs to balance the budget in economies which we still rely today hugely on oil and gas revenues. Iraq is an extreme case. In my opinion, in some years, we saw almost 100% of their export revenues being met by oil revenues. So imagine what the pain they must have faced when COVID hit. But also, if you think about other places in the region where they trumpet the diversification effort by talking about the non-oil GDP growing at a fast rate, but actually when you plot it against the oil price, you can see that it's still closely related to movement in oil prices. So we haven't done the serious economic diversification that is needed to give those economies the robustness that they need to face a world where demand would peak and decline, and competition will intensify between producers. Now, one thing here in this respect, when we talk about the economic situation in the Middle East among the major oil producers, I noticed that most conversations tend to focus on, I would call it the triple whammy, not only a double whammy, because we had the COVID impact, we had the decline in oil price, and the decline in volumes in exports because of the OPEC Plus agreement. But many people overlook the fact that actually these countries started 2020 on a weaker footing than anybody else, because if you look at the growth rate in the region, they were negative, and to be precise, they were around minus 0.3% in 2019, while the rest of the world was growing at around 3%. Why? Because these countries are still recovering from the shock of the oil price collapse in 2014. So before that, if you look at the years between 2007 and 2014, those countries embarked on a major spending spree, only to be hit by shrinking revenues because of a decline in prices that is still enduring even, and then that's how they started COVID-19, facing it on a weaker footing than other countries. And interestingly, there was an IMF application. I like to refer to it often because, again, it did not receive the attention it deserves because of the COVID shock that, of course, captured all attention. It was published in February 2020 about the fiscal sustainability of the GCC economies. And they said, and I quote, "At current fiscal stance, the GCC financial wealth could be depleted by 2034. And of course, they talk about all the necessary reforms that are needed to kind of offset the exposure of the vulnerability of the local economies to decline in price. So all this we have to think about, not just zoom in on the impact of COVID, but take a much broader perspective to understand the structural problem of that region, whereby that need to be tackled for the region to really capitalize on its low-cost oil and gas resources. And my last point, where I like, again, it goes back to the conclusion that Michael referred to, that is the role of renewable energy and the energy transition. And there was an interesting article, actually, Michael drew my attention to it, published by the IEA, and I think it was the Deputy Iraqi Prime Minister, if I'm not mistaken, who co-authored that paper about the role of that oil and gas producers can play in helping the world achieving their net zero targets. Now, this might sound a bit controversial, but actually there is lots of sense, common sense behind that thinking if you look at it from a broader mind. And first of all, you can see that even when oil demand peaks, the world will continue to consume oil, and I would add to that gas for some time to come, even though demand would peak and start declining. That all will have to come from somewhere. And we are being told by the heads of states, by the heads of the national oil companies in the Middle East, how privileged they are, not in terms only of the scale and the cost of their oil resources, but in terms of the carbon intensity of their resources. So by burning one molecule of oil, you emit less CO2 than, for example, if you burn one molecule of oil, let's say from Venezuela. And that is something that they would like to capitalize on. The other thing, if you look at the region, you see that they are quite keen on portraying a green image. So as energy producers, not just an oil and gas producer. And actually, to be fair, they are putting a lot of money in green projects. However, if you look at those investments, you can see that they are going into projects that extend the shelf life or the life of their valuable assets, that is oil and gas. So they are going big on blue hydrogen, which uses oil, for example, natural gas as a feedstock, and they are using technologies such as carbon capture, storage, or carbon capture usage and storage. And at the end, when you think of the Middle East, because of this dependence on oil revenues, they have the capital needed to invest in these kind of expensive projects. So in other words, the oil and gas revenues are being used to fund the energy transition domestically and with spillovers on the rest of the world. But I'm going to conclude with one last point about the issue of coal, which also tends to be overlooked in this discussion about the energy transition. And this is where the Middle East can particularly capitalize on its gas resources. I know gas is not the ideal fuel from a climate change perspective, but we did a couple of studies at Crystol Energy to see how much carbon emissions you can save by simply switching from coal to gas and power generation versus switching from coal to renewable energy also in the electricity sector. And you can easily save double the amount of CO2 by switching from coal to gas than if you do the switching from coal to renewable energy over the same period. Or in other words, you can achieve faster reductions in CO2 over a shorter period with the switch from coal to gas. So we should not underestimate the role of gas in the energy transition, nor the role of oil to support the energy transition, at least in its early years. But overall, in the very longer term, when the energy transition takes place at full speed, then these economies in the Middle East, their main tool would be economic diversification to improve their resilience. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Carole. I think we have so much on the table now. I want to encourage our audience to get engaged. So again, if you'd like to ask a question, you can pose it in the Q&A. If you're watching the webinar, if you're watching through YouTube, you can email a question to events@mei.edu. But I would like to maybe drill down a little bit more, sorry for the pun, on the gas issue, because, Carole, you made the point that, yes, this is certainly part of the diversification agenda. It's part of the idea of a transition fuel, but not all NOCs are in the same position to be able to invest into the sector. And I thought Michael's slide on where we see flaring, it's really Iraq and Iran. These are also the places, Iran especially, which is the most, the biggest subsidizer of electricity in the region. What the waste that's happening, really, right? And how do you capture that product, put it into pipelines, put it into even, perhaps into making hydrogen products? How do you give a message to international oil companies that this is worth doing? It has an environmental impact, but it also has, a growth story, an economic story. Michael, I don't know if you could make any comment on that.
Sure. Yeah. I mean, I think I think you're right. There has to be I think the solution has to come back to providing the right policy backdrop to price that externality, and I think that there are clearly going to be barriers to seeing that a carbon price or a GHG price being enacted in certain jurisdictions and in certain countries. But it's it's kind of common sense. And if there are ways in which some of these governments can have a way of providing incentives and pricing the benefit of reducing that waste, then I think some of that can come to market. But I think the other thing to keep in mind is just to ensure that there is a level playing field across all different types of energy options. And I think one thing that you said, Carole, is that yes, it may be the case that many of the countries across the Middle East that are producing oil and gas have a view that they will have the lowest cost of that product available, and that therefore they will be the last man standing, so to say. But I think what the energy transition and this broader move towards an energy transition highlights is that it may not be the Middle East choice. There may be other jurisdictions at which they are selling their oil and gas into, which choose to move in a direction of a more decarbonized option. And yes, there will be a continued need for exploration, continued need for development, and continued, hundreds of billions of dollars of investment every year in those oil and gas resources. I don't think anybody can argue with that across even all the most deepest decarbonization scenarios. But I think I would suggest that there will be other criteria in addition to cost that may start to matter. And as from a modeling perspective, we think about that by ensuring that the cost takes into account societal need or societal desire for a carbon price, or either implicit or explicit. And so if the European geography or the North American geography or Asian geography takes into account or starts to value more the cost of those implicit emissions or the intensity of that production process, then it may not be simply economic cost that says one molecule of a hydrocarbon lives to fight another day. It may be based on other criteria. And I think that's something to just be thinking about when we think about what the future supply mix looks like.
Karen, can I add to your question about the gas and the flaring issue? It's definitely a waste of a valuable resource, but what is being flared, for those of you who are not familiar, is the associated gas. And that is produced along oil. So, and in countries like Iraq, I know when I first looked at Iraq many, many years ago in my previous life was ENI at the beginning of the 2009 licensing round. The big project of capturing associated gas was on the table and companies were keen on it, but that by itself is quite costly. It needs the right support from the government. The technology is proven. Angola is producing LNG partly from capturing associated gas. So the technology is out there. But if you don't provide the right institutional framework to justify and encourage the investment and the capital commitment in these projects, you have the situation that you have today, that you have no other choice but flaring gas. There's the other choice, which is also to explore for non-associated gas. And here you see you have a big spectrum across the region where now gas in some countries is capturing greater attention. Look at Saudi Arabia, for example, where they're even exploring and they're unconventional resources. Whereas in countries like Iraq, where you have plenty of non-associated gas, it's still, you see that the development is going at a snail pace. And this goes back again to the need for offering the right contractual terms for investors to come. So at the end, we don't have to dictate what kind of technology, and we offer the right above ground conditions to investors, and investors will be creative enough to justify allocating their money in this if it makes sense. And it's becoming more and more difficult, not only because of COVID and the capital discipline that we saw after COVID, but for the energy transition where international investors would be much more selective.
Thanks. We've got a couple of questions that have come into the Q&A function, but I think we need to talk about a couple of things. So first is this rise in electricity really demand. That's particularly across emerging markets, definitely in the Middle East and North Africa. And then thinking about how these states have been beginning now to trade more and supply each other. I mean, very interesting things going on, perhaps in trying to get fuel to Lebanon right now, and Egypt's capacity to export. Interesting things in thinking about also connecting grid systems, right? So it's one thing to ship, an LNG to a power plant, or even oil for a power plant. Another to, have actually interconnectivity within the region. So I wonder how you see this in terms of also meeting that, if we could decline 6% in terms of our carbon emissions every year for the next decade or more, electricity use is probably a good way to start doing that, right? I mean, transport's going to be a little harder. So, where is the mismatch there, or, is there potential? This would mean, of course, building, I suppose, solar power plants, or something we didn't talk about, nuclear plants. How best would that be achieved? So the question from Mohammed in the chat was really about this grid operation. Do we know about the needs for, creating a better interconnected grid within the region, where that might be possible? And I would add to that the sense of, there's so much focus in MENA countries about the export market, really beyond the region. So for North Africa, that's looking at the European market. For the Gulf, that's looking at Asia. How would you recommend shifting the focus more, a little bit region specifically?
So I think there are two broader points that come from the energy outlook that we did in 2020. One is that across all of the scenarios that we put forward, electrification and electricity increasingly becomes the primary vector that you consume energy. And what that means, and the second point is that what that means is that much of the across the world, we move away from a world where we have to engage in long-term oil and gas transit for the provision of energy, and to a world that is increasingly locally provided and electrified, because those assets are closer at hand. Again, over the long term. And so obviously there are going to be geographies where geopolitics and borders make that much more complex. And so I think that it's important to understand and to ensure that the countries in the region, through the work of many different NGOs that are already working in the region doing this, have an understanding of the energy potential within their own borders, and understand what are the combination of different technologies, whether, all different lower carbon technologies and others that can serve to at least decarbonize within a country's particular border, so that they can maximize the value of their own resource wealth to the export markets. And so that's clearly one of the key sort of components of what IRENA has been doing for the last over a decade, is ensuring that countries in the region know and put on a level playing field different technologies. But I don't think that there are any please, I mean, I wouldn't assume that there are going to be any easy answers. It's just, I guess the recommendation would be just ensure a level playing field and ensure that cost structures, agreements, power purchase agreements are able to be in a way, or being set in a way to provide the opportunity to those low cost and increasingly lower cost, low carbon options, so that the carbon intensity of domestic consumption is minimized.
Karen, let me also add one more dimension, because I'm not quite sure how politically correct that will sound, or incorrect, but I have to state the plain fact that we are talking about a region which is politically fragmented. There are ongoing disputes between neighbors. And before I talk about the electricity interconnection, which makes dependence on your neighbor even more critical. But think about the gas. Again, we go back to gas. Why the gas market in the Middle East is far from being well developed, despite the fact that there's no shortage of gas resources. Why, for example, countries like Kuwait or other neighboring countries, they go and they import LNG from very far places, including from Norway, even from the US, when they are sitting next door to the largest holders of proven gas reserves in the world. And how many gas pipelines in the region you find interconnected pipelines across the region? There's only one main pipeline, that is a dolphin pipeline between Qatar, Oman, and the UAE. So that conveys an important, a fundamental problem in the region. As long as you have that problem, we have to remain realistic in terms of what we expect when it comes to interconnection, whether for grids or for a gas pipeline. And unfortunately, it is that kind of political fragmentation that is holding the region back when it comes to exploiting its full energy potential.
It may not be politically correct, but it's politically factually correct. So right. Thank you, Carole. It's exactly right. And it is a frustration, right? Because the more that governments feel that they need to focus, internally, or that they can't rely on a neighbor for a long-term power commitment, that just hinders everybody's growth, as I think we've seen pretty clearly. I wanted to get to this point that you made, Carole, and I agree with you. The IMF report on GCC fiscal sustainability was a really important one, and somewhat controversial. I mean, governments didn't like it very much, right? That there was the sense that there might be this massive drawdown on reserve assets and the inability to continue basically spending what they're spending when the revenue to spending gap seems to be persistent, and certainly since 2015 and not really going away. But we also have seen a lot of measures by especially Gulf governments to kind of amplify this fiscal adjustment in terms of increasing taxes, cutting government spending on the public sector wage bill, and being more dynamic and competitive in the way they think about foreign labor as well. So we're seeing a lot of movement there. But then in the basics, as you say, like in Saudi Arabia, I think the SEC, the Saudi electricity company, still, relies more than 50% on domestic electricity production is basically from oil. And so, the target is to get that up to 25, maybe 30% renewable power production in the next decade. But right now, I think it's less than 2%. So how do you match, the real need to, yes, focus on export revenue, get that product to market rather than selling it cheaply at home, but also, getting people used to the idea of paying more, constructing new plants. I mean, this is something that doesn't happen overnight. So I don't know, Carole or Michael, I mean, what would, the crisis is here. It's already been really the double or the triple whammy, as you said, Carole. We know it's there, but what would it take to really, ramp up that attention and investment into particularly renewable power production in the Gulf, but beyond that as well?
Carole, do you want to go first?
Yeah, I'd be happy to do that. I mean, first, let me highlight two things in relation to the reforms that have been announced. So, of course, for example, I mentioned Saudi Arabia and other neighboring countries in the region. They all announced some kind of reforms to reduce government spending and raise some non-oil revenues, including raising taxes such as VAT. But those reforms, which were, we've been all waiting for a long time, at least economists, they happened at the wrong time. So usually you would expect these to happen when the economy is healthy, oil prices are doing well, so you reduce the impact on those who are going to face this kind of additional burden. But actually, they have happened at the time when prices went down. So we have this kind of pro-cyclical fiscal policy where the cycle, that vicious cycle, needs to be broken in the region. And second, to add on that element of the reforms, they tend to be driven by prices, by oil prices. So when prices go down, we hear, it's not the first time you hear about these kind of reforms. Actually, if you look back, even from the 1970s, you hear this kind of reforms announced only to be ditched and forgotten as soon as prices recovered. But this takes me to the point that answers your question, Karen. I think the talk about the energy transition, the fact that the world is quite serious about relying more on renewable energy. I don't want to say like removing entirely fossil fuels, that will take a while to happen. But the fact that we are heading in this direction should by itself raise a strong alarming bell for these countries and their people, that the old model of doing business in the country is not really sustainable and needs to be updated. And again, we go back to this concept of robust economies. So I think the issue of energy transition might actually bring more benefit than actually being detrimental to the economies in the Middle East. And one of the benefits is that it will push a serious economic reform agenda if they want to, again, I want to say the last country standing, because Michael said that we should look beyond that. But if they want to really still stay in the energy business for as long as possible. And here I'm going to highlight the UAE. They have been doing a pretty good job in that respect. And again, they are using oil and gas revenues, but they are doing wise investments in the various projects, whether it's through Masdar as well. I think it may not succeed as the original plans were, because we know that renewable energy comes with all sorts of complications and difficulties, but they are moving ahead because they want to shift from this image of being oil and gas producers to being a modern energy producers.
That's right. And it's also more of a state strategy to focus on the economy, which has, been front and center of the kind of new formation of their 50-year vision in the UAE, which is very interesting. Michael, I wonder if we can turn to you. We have another question, and then maybe we'll close at 11:30. And I'm glad that someone asked about Russia, and then somewhat tangentially about sanctions on Iran. I wonder, in your data collection, we saw a lot in terms of the increase in energy demand in emerging markets, but Russia is certainly a competitor to Middle East, especially gas suppliers. But also oil suppliers. And what's domestic consumption like in Russia? Where is their growth trajectory? And how do you think this impacts decision-making for their energy sector as well?
So I think for Russia, their market is becoming increasingly Asia-focused as well. And so some of that is starting to take away from the amount of natural gas that they intend to, want to, and in this year plan to send into the European market. And there's not that much interconnectedness between the Eastern Siberian gas fields and Western Siberian and Yamal, production bases. So obviously the gas market is very regional. And it is becoming more global, and LNG is the nexus for that. But I think, to answer the question in terms of how that affects the competitiveness of Middle Eastern gas, it's clear that the more and more we get away from oil-linked contracts into natural gas and gas-on-gas competition, the more likely that we are to see a sort of increased competitiveness to the delivered LNG from say Qatar and pipeline natural gas delivered into Europe. So all of that, is taken into account in our modeling on a regional basis for natural gas prices. But I guess the point is, and I will reemphasize the point that Carole mentioned earlier, that the Middle East is sitting on a massive trove of natural gas. But I think the point is that when you look at the destination of that gas and the net zero commitments by Asia and the net zero commitments in the EU context, those two markets are the prime and were conceived as the prime targets for all of this incremental natural gas perspective investment. And so that just means that the marketers and those countries are going to need to search for other markets. And I'm not saying that those other markets won't grow. It's just that if the EU and China are true to their targets, then competition is going to steepen in places where those molecules have traditionally gone into.
And I think that has some, very real implications in terms of the foreign policy and geopolitical relationships the Middle East is forming now, the way that in Washington, we're very obsessed with the idea of great power competition, but also how Russia and China may not be, such friends in the Middle East to energy producers there for so long. So that's a big debate here in the policy community. Anyway, I think we've exhausted our questions, and you guys did such a fantastic job. So much information shared with us this morning. I'm really grateful to both of you, Michael Cohen and Carole Nakhle. Wonderful to have you with us at the Middle East Institute, and I hope we can have you back again very soon. Thank you, guys. Have a